Okay, today we're going to be talking about solving quadratic equations not by using factoring. So the first thing is the square root property, which basically says if u squared equals d, and d is a positive real number, then u is the positive or negative square root of d. Okay, let's do an example. If we have x squared equals 9, we take the square root to remove the squared, and we do that to both sides. So we get x equals the positive square root of 9, which is 3, or x equals the negative square root of 9, which is negative 3. So the solutions of x squared equals 9 are 3 and negative 3. And you can check this by saying negative 3 times negative 3, or negative 3 squared, is positive 9, and 3 squared is also positive 9. Moving on, let's do some examples here. Now, we have 3x squared equals 18, but we have to get the x squared all by itself so that we isolate whatever squared on one side and get everything else on the other side. So how do we do that? Well, this is 3 times x squared, so we're going to divide both sides by 3. Then, once we do that, this 3 will go away, and 18 divided by 3 is 6. Now that we have x squared isolated on one side, we take the square root of x squared and the square root of 6, and we get x equals the positive or negative square root of 6. Okay? So that's one example. Now let's do a little bit trickier example. Now we need the x squared all by itself, so we want to take care of this minus 7 first. We do the opposite. We add 7 to both sides. So we get 2x squared equals 7. Then we have to get rid of that 2, which is multiplied by x squared, and divide it through on each side. It gets rid of that 2, and it becomes the fraction 7 halves. So x squared equals 7 halves. So take the square root, and when you take the square root of a fraction, you take the square root of the top and the square root of a bottom. You can't leave the square root on the bottom, so you multiply the top and the bottom by the whatever's on the bottom. And 7 times 2 is 14. Square root of 2 times square root of 2 is 2. That way we don't have that square root on the bottom. So whatever you have on the bottom, if it's the square root, you just multiply the top and the bottom by whatever that is. And that'll get rid of it. And remember the jail analogy. The 2 and the 7 are still in jail, so they can't come out. All right, let's look at this one. Oh boy. We have x minus 1 quantity squared equals 5. So we got a couple options. We could either multiply this all out, x minus 1 times x minus 1, and then subtract the 5, and then factor it. Yuck. Let's just look at this and say, hey, we have x minus 1 squared. The squared is isolated already, so we can just take the square root of both sides. That gives us x minus 1 equals the positive and negative square root of 5. This becomes a much easier problem. Then we just have to get rid of this minus 1, so we want to add 1 to both sides. And then it just becomes x equals 1 plus or minus the square root of 5. Which means 1 plus the square root of 5, or 1 minus the square root of 5. Okay? Now let's look at the quadratic formula. You may remember this from last year. It's a formula that we can plug in our numbers. So we have x equals negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. So in our regular equation, we have ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0. That's where these a's, b's, and c's comes from. Okay? Let's work one out. So we have the quadratic equation 2x squared plus 9x minus 5 equals 0. So it's already equal to 0, so that part's done. And then remember, this is ax squared plus bx plus c. So a is 2, b is 9, and c is negative 5 because this minus goes with the 5. Just like this is positive 9. Okay, once we have our a, our b, and our c, then we're going to fill in our equation here of x equals negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. So we're going to plug those values in, just like we did. And I use parentheses when putting those in. So when I plug things into the calculator, I don't end up with a wrong answer, especially when the squared here, because if, unlike that first equation that we did with the square root of 9, it could be 3 and negative 3. A lot of people forget to put the parentheses and end up with a negative squared number, and you're not going to get that. So first thing we're going to do is we're going to figure out the discriminant, this little part under the square root sign. And if it's positive, you know you have two solutions. If it's, oh, this is wrong. If it's 0, you have one solution, and if it's negative, there are no solutions. So let's calculate this, and I just put that right in my calculator just like that, and I ended up with 121. So that's a positive number. So we have two solutions, and the square root of 121 is 11. And I cleaned up this, like negative 9 is negative 9, and 2 times 2 is 4. So that's where the negative 9 and 4 is. Now, once we get here, a lot of people are tempted to say that's the answer. This is not the answer because we can go further. We can break that into two separate equations. We have negative 9 plus 11 over 4, which is 2/4, which is 1/2. 1/2 is an answer you would put in. The other answer is negative 9 minus 11 over 4, which is negative 20 over 4, which is negative 5. Those are your two answers. 1/2, negative 5. So, to repeat what we did here, you plug these three numbers into our equation, our formula. Then you figure out your discriminant and figure out how many roots there are. Then you clean it up a little. Then you take the square root, if you can. If it's a whole number, you break it into two equations and simplify as far as you can. Okay? Let's do another example of this just to really cement it. Okay. So we have 2x squared equals 4x plus 1. Well, the first thing we notice is this is not equal to 0. So we're going to subtract the 4x and subtract 1. So that we get 2x squared minus 4x minus 1 equals 0. I prefer to do it that way rather than making the 2 negative because I think if you just subtract the 2x squared, it gets really messy when trying to do the quadratic formula. And so I prefer to keep the a as a positive number. So we have ax squared plus bx plus c. So a is 2, b is negative 4, and c is negative 1. Now, x equals negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. Went a little quicker than I was expecting. So we plug those values in. And then we're going to put this in our calculator. The negative 4 squared comes out to be positive 16. And then minus negative 8, which is 16 plus 8, is 24. So we know that 4 squared is 16 and 5 squared is 25. So 24 is not going to be a whole number. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to do a factor tree, which should be reviewed for you, but if it's not, here we go. 24, we want to think of two numbers that multiply to 24. Well, I picked 4 and 6 because it doesn't matter which two you pick. Then we want to break 4 down. 4 is what times what? Well, 4 is 2 times 2. And these are both prime, so we can stop. Then we say 6 is what times what? Well, that's 2 times 3. And those are both prime, so we stop. Now we have our factor tree. We're going to look at these 4 numbers. Now, like I alluded to earlier, the radical sign is like prison. When you're in prison, you need a partner to break out. Think about the Shawshank Redemption. Excellent movie. Andy, who is in prison, needs Red's help before he can break out because he has to have a poster of Raquel Welch and he needs a little like rock hammer for making chess pieces. So Red gets him these things and helps him to break out. That is going to be, I'm not going to spoiler it for you. But anyway, you need a partner to break out of jail. So we're going to look here and say, do I have a set? Like 2 things that are exactly the same. Well, yes, I have a pair of 2s. They're partners. They break out of jail. Then I also have these 2. Does this 2 have a partner? No. Does this 3 have a partner? No. They are stuck in jail. So what that means, and I'm going to show you here as I clean up, like -4 is +4. So that becomes 4 plus or minus 2 square root 6. So the 2's break out of jail, they come right here. The 2 and the 3 that are still in jail because they don't have any partners get multiplied back together and they're still in jail. So they cannot get out of there. Okay? So this does not have a jail attached, so we can't add the 4 and the 2 square root 6. And then we have this 4 down here. What we want to do next is we want to look at these 3 free numbers. Not the 6. They're stuck in jail. There's nothing we can do to help them. But these 3, we look and we say, what number could I divide each of these by that would divide evenly? 2. I can divide 4 by 2, and I can divide 2 by 2. 4 divided by 2 is 2. 2 divided by 2 is 1. So this becomes 2. This becomes 2. 1, we don't need to put a 1 in front of the square root of 6, just like we don't put a 1 in front of a variable. This then is your final answer, this 2 plus square root of 6 divided by 2. Okay? If the expression under the square root simplifies to a negative number, then we have no solutions. So that's why you always do this part first. Okay? Now, this page of your notes tells you the most efficient technique to use when solving a quadratic equation. I will tell you that if you can factor it, go ahead and factor it. Factoring isn't going to work for everything. If you can get the x squared by itself, like in this case where there's no b, then you absolutely could do the take a square root of each side. If it's already separated for you, go ahead and do that. The quadratic formula works every single time. So that might be something else for you. Okay, good luck.